everyone. Welcome everyone to our PALB2 Carriers Information Session. It's the fourth time we've been running it with the great panel that we've got today. My name is Julia Bainam. I'm a PALB2 carrier. I've been diagnosed with breast cancer, got treated in 2019. I've got a 5-year anniversary this year. I'm very happy to chair this important webinar where we provide additional information, answer your questions, latest research, and also patient perspectives and patient journeys, and share with you all who join the webinar. I'm also a trustee or board member of the local charity that looks after people that are impacted by cancer, not just breast cancer, in West Sussex, in the area where I live in the UK. And I'm also involved in a couple of important national research studies with Mark and others at the University of Cambridge as the Can Risk and Embrace studies. So very happy to be chairing the meeting today. Okay, so what are the objectives? Objectives are to share with you the latest research. This is something that Mark will cover, and I'll introduce him in a minute. Laura Price has joined us. She is a fellow PALB2 carrier and will share her story. I also collated quite a lot of Q&As from our group on Facebook. So I've got about 26 questions. They have been put in different categories, but we will also open the call towards the end for the questions from the audience. So bear with us. Some of the questions might be answered earlier on during the research updates. Therefore, if I could ask to hold on from asking specific questions for a bit later on in the webinar. Okay, so this is our agenda. I will do the intros of the panel in a second. So here's our panel today. I would like to introduce Laura Price. Laura is a food writer, broadcaster. She's got 2 podcasts that she chairs. One is about food, very exciting, and one with a charity called Breast Cancer Now, the largest UK breast cancer charity. And Laura also writes books, and she will share with us her story and her journey as a PALB2 carrier and what it meant for her. Next is Professor Mark Tishkovich, who is the top PALB2 expert in the world. Mark will not be shy when I say that, should not be shy when I say that. He's based in University of Cambridge and runs a number of very important research studies, as well as chairing a PALB2 interest group that is brings together all the top specialists, genetic specialists in the world that are looking after PALB2 and other hereditary cancer genes to share exchange knowledge, etc. And a number of studies are being run globally to research more into this gene and others. I also would like to introduce, I'll go with Vishaka because Vishaka joined the call. We've got Andrew slightly delayed in traffic. So Vishaka, Dr. Vishaka Tripathi, she is a consultant genetic counselor at Guy's and St. Thomas's Hospital in London. She leads the hereditary breast and ovarian cancer service called HPOC that I'm also under. And she also the chair of the Genetic Counselor Registration Board and a member of the Clinical Genetics Group for NHS England. There might be some other titles, Vishaka. I'll let you to introduce yourself later on and cover those. And Dr. Anja Kulkarni, who's joining us shortly. She's a consultant clinical geneticist and lead for the cancer genetics service at Guy's Hospital. She's also on the board and has a number of regional and national roles, including UK Cancer Genetics Group and medical advisor to the UK Genetic Counselling Registration Board. Very complicated titles, but this is the top people in the UK who are on the panel today, so I'm very happy. And thank you so much for the panelists to join. We self-organize this webinars on an annual basis. The team gives their personal time to this, so I'm very grateful for them to join. Okay, so just before we start the formal part of the session, I would like to point out the 3 previous sessions because we're building on those as we go along. For example, the first session in 2020, we covered some basic knowledge about PALB2, what it means, how to understand the variants better. So I would advise you to, if you want to learn more about the background and basics of the gene, please go on YouTube, and you will be able to find that session, Googling putting in the search PALB2 Information Session. And then the second year, which is 2021, we also had Professor Andrew Tutt, who joined us and talked about PALB and other developments and medication side of things. We also published that year a PALB2 information booklet that I will share the link to in the PALB2 Warriors group. That's also been available, and the team on the call has produced it together with the Royal Marsden Hospital. And then last year we didn't have the session, but the year before we did a similar format with the patient representatives and also lots of Q&As. And over that time, there were also published national and international guidelines for PALB2 management. This is some agreed guidelines that every territory or country might be using in deciding how to treat people with the breast cancer and the PALB2 carrier. Okay, the ground rules for today for the call. Being respectful, obviously there's a privacy, people sharing their personal stories. We're not going to be providing personal medical advice. We'll be sharing the research and some central information. So if you do need to consult on your specific case, please do contact your medical team for that. And if you've got any additional questions, please put them into Q&As, and I will take a look at them as we go along. In terms of the recording, we will record the formal part of the session and also central Q&As that I've received. As soon as we go into the live audience Q&As, we will switch the camera off because you might want to ask some specific things you don't want to be recorded. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand over to Mark, who will talk about what's the latest in research.
Thank you, Yulia, and welcome everybody. Yulia's already introduced me. So what I'm going to do is really just give you an update over a few key themes that have emerged over the last couple of years in PALB2. Next slide, please, Yulia. So I think one of the most important things is people are always asking, how common is PALB2? And I think finally we've got some useful figures actually. This is a big table, but if you just press next, so you can see the key genes that are highlighted here, and you can see, so I put PALB2 together with BRCA1 and BRCA2, and importantly, you can see that in the general population, about 1 in 750 women and men carry a gene alteration, a mutation in the PALB2 gene. So that's how we now know roughly how common it is. So it's more common than BRCA1, but less common than BRCA2. And if you then think about any woman who has had been diagnosed with breast cancer of any age, about 0.5% of them, so about 1 in 200, will have an alteration in the PALB2 gene. And that clearly, if you're younger, so if you're under 50 or under 40 and have a breast cancer, this will be higher because this includes all women of any age essentially. So if you're 75 and have breast cancer, it's not very likely to be due to PALB2. But these are just good ballpark figures. So it generally gives you an idea. And this is something that people are always asking, how common is it? How much of breast cancer does it cause? Well, I think here we have the answers basically. And also this puts it in context with other genes. Next slide. The other thing that is interesting, that we found out fairly, in the last couple of years is what types of breast cancer the PALB2 gene causes. Because there is a type of breast cancer called triple negative breast cancer, which doesn't respond very well to hormone treatment and usually gets treated with chemotherapy up front. And that's particularly common in women who carry gene alterations in the BRCA1 gene. And people are always wondering about PALB2 as well. And you can see from this table that in the first column there, this is women under 40, in the second column, women over 60, and then the final column, any age. So the third row down, PALB2. You can see that it's very similar to the the rate of triple negative breast cancer compared to BRCA2. So those numbers are almost identical, whereas BRCA1 is completely different. So many more women, BRCA1 causes many more triple negative breast cancers than BRCA2 or PALB2 does. But nevertheless, PALB2 and BRCA2, the rate is slightly higher than the general population, because you can see on the bottom line there, the women where it says none, those are the women who have no alterations on any of these genes, and you can see that the rate of triple negative breast cancer of PALB2 and BRCA2 is still a bit higher than the general population, but it's nowhere near like BRCA1. So I think that we've answered that question as well, because that's been a question that comes up a lot. Next slide, please. So, we know that BRCA1 and BRCA2 interact closely together with PALB2. You can see that on this little diagram here in the middle. And BRCA1 and BRCA2 always get lumped together, mainly because they were both found in the mid-90s together. BRCA1 was found in 1994, BRCA2, 1995. So for many years, and PALB2 wasn't really discovered until 2007. So for many years, BRCA1 and BRCA2 have been lumped together, and PALB2 has been looked at as a separate gene. But really, next slide, please, Julia. But really, if you think about what we know now, I think that really what you should be doing is lumping BRCA2 and PALB2 together, because they're much similar. I've put the rates of ovarian cancer down there for you, and the rates of this triple negative breast cancer, almost identical rates of triple negative breast cancer, quite similar rates of ovarian cancer, which are both much lower than the BRCA1. So, there's no doubt about it that these are the three most important genes in breast cancer. And, I think it's a bit of a historical, quirk that actually it's BRCA1 and BRCA2 and then PALB2. If all three genes have been found together, I think we'd just be calling them BRCA1, BRCA2, and BRCA3. Next slide, please. People often ask me about other cancers and PALB2. The truth is, we don't have great data. Our current data is based on about 500 families. And by comparison, this is a study that came out just over a couple of years ago now, where they were looking at over 5,000 families in BRCA1 and BRCA2. So they've got 10 times as many families. Again, this is partly because these two genes were discovered, over a decade before PALB2. So much more information about these two genes. But we know they work similar. So I think we can extrapolate, a lot of the findings in these two genes, we can extrapolate them to PALB2. And the main findings are that actually for most cancers in these two genes, there isn't really an increased risk for other cancers. It's very clear that the focus is very much on breast cancer, ovarian cancer, male breast cancer, possibly some pancreatic cancer, and in BRCA2, some prostate cancer as well. Now, there's some question marks about some other cancers, maybe stomach cancer in BRCA1 and BRCA2, but those risks are quite small. But for other things like leukemias, kidney, esophagus, there's no increased risk in this big study. So I think, we could extrapolate, make a reasonable assumption that PALB2 will have a similar pattern. Now, we know that PALB2 does cause breast cancer, that's the main cancer, a small increased risk for ovarian cancer, a small increased risk for pancreatic cancer. I think there's a bit of question mark over prostate cancer still. Maybe it does, but if it is, it's not going to be a very big risk. There's a question mark over stomach cancer. Again, if it does, the risk is not going to be very high. If there were high risks of other cancers, we would know about them. What we struggle with is to identify small increased risk of cancers, because for that you need large large amounts of data, large numbers of families, and that's where we're a bit limited. But I think we could be assured that we're not missing, some cancer that PALB2 is causing that we don't know about in a very, that's causing a very increased risk. Okay, next slide, please. The other thing I want to talk about was, one of the things that we're very interested in is how the risk of cancer, or particularly breast cancer, gets modified, because we know that not every woman who has an alteration in the PALB2 gene has the same risk of breast cancer. It varies quite a lot. But how can we give a woman a more personalized risk estimate. You know, so we can, so for that particular woman, we can tell her more precisely what her own risk is. And I use this slide to illustrate the fact that, just as with height, as with breast cancer risk, we know that there are some extreme causes of breast cancer, like the BRCA1, BRCA2 genes, for example, and they're sort of outliers. But if you look at the normal population range, I mean, breast cancer is very common. There will be a range of women in that normal population, some of whom have a small increase, you know, perhaps a below population risk of breast cancer, and some who have a high risk of breast cancer, because we know that there are hundreds of genetic modifiers that are modifying breast cancer risk beyond the main genes that we talk about a lot. And it's the same with height. I mean, height is, you know, completely variable. And, you know, again, there are hundreds of modifying factors that, you know, determine how tall someone is. You inherit some of these from your mother, some of these from your father. Then it depends on other things like diet, you know, and other factors as well. But that explains the variation in height. And there's something similar going on that explains the variation in breast cancer in the general population. And if we could superimpose that on the PALB2 gene alteration, we could then provide a more precise risk estimate for a particular woman. So if you go to the next slide, and this is what I've tried to illustrate here. So this is here's a very simple family tree, a 40-year-old who's got no breast cancer, but we found that she's got a PALB2 gene alteration. There's also no breast cancer in her family. This was just found, you know, maybe it's just found randomly by some, you know, genetic testing. She was having genetic testing for something else. They found a PALB2 gene alteration. Now, you know, so that's a woman, you know, who's got a PALB2 gene alteration with no other modifying factors at this point in time. And her average risk, she's 40, her average risk to age 80 will be about just under 50%, essentially, if you just take that alone. Next slide. Now, if you add in these weak genetic modifiers, and for example, here, she is as well as inheriting the PALB2 gene alteration, she's inherited a particular combination of other genetic modifiers that are making the risk, that are increasing the risk as well on top of the PALB2 gene alteration. You can see how that might influence the risk here. So here her risk has gone from just below 50% to about 65%. And next slide. And at the other end of the spectrum, if she's inherited, she might have inherited a particular combination of other genetic modifiers that are actually protective, against breast cancer. And in this case, her risk from the PALB2 gene alteration will have gone from just below 50% to about 30%. So about a 20% drop, just because she's, as well as inheriting the PALB2 gene alteration, she's inherited all these other modifiers that sort of counteract that particular, the actual PALB2 alteration. And this is something that we're working on at the moment, exploring how we can use this in clinical practice and how we can give someone a more precise risk. Next slide, please. And to do that, we're using a particular program called CanRisk, which has been developed in Cambridge. And with this, we can combine various other factors. So we can combine the genetic factors, lifestyle factors like breast cancer weight, like your weight is quite important. So weight, we know that being overweight is a risk factor for breast cancer. Alcohol slightly increases your risk. There are hormonal risk factors. So for example, if you start your periods early, have children late, that increases your risk. And then of course, your family history is important as well. So we can combine all that together. Next. And then what we can do with that is give a more precise risk estimate to try and tailor someone's management to decide whether or not they might benefit from risk-reducing therapy, risk-reducing surgery, or what difference modifying their lifestyle or behavior might make. Next slide. So this is work that we're doing as a big team. There's a big team that's working on the CanRisk, and it's now developed as a tool. It's used as it's got a medical license. It's being used worldwide, and it's become quite an important tool for the global community in terms of predicting breast cancer risk. This is one of the main areas of research that we're driving forward at the moment. I think I've got my last slide coming up. Yeah, so how can you help PALB2 research? Well, we do have a PALB2 interest group, where we meet. And also we have an email address here. We work together with the Embrace study, also based in Cambridge. And we have a website. Unfortunately, the website is currently inactive. That's due to a cyber attack that we had earlier this year. But we're hoping to get that up and running as soon as we can. But it might still take some time, so you're going to have to bear with us on that one. And I will finish there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. Just one question from me. Is there new, in terms of testing, any updates on PALB2 testing in the UK or genetic testing panel? Anything new in the last year or two?
Well, it's now standard. It's now always done together with BRCA1 and BRCA2. So it's on a standard NHS breast cancer panel. The standard NHS breast cancer panel's got 7 genes on it. So I think there's always a question about if you were tested before 2018, you may not have been on, and you had breast cancer, the PALB2 gene may not have been on. But you can always speak to your local genetics service and ask them to review that and see whether or not they can retest. But certainly from 2018 onwards, everyone should be having PALB2 testing as a routine. And that's pretty much the same throughout the world, actually.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to ask people to put questions if you've got any into the chat, but we will go into Q&As later on. So hold on your questions. And yeah, I would like to invite Laura to talk about her journey.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you.
Brilliant. Julia, thank you so much for inviting me and for organizing this call. And Mark, thank you so much for that intro. I have learned so much there and I'm absolutely fascinated by all these facts and figures. So I will definitely be joining in anything that you're doing in future. So hello to everybody around the world. I'm Laura Price, as you can see from the screen. I'm based in London. And Julia invited me to talk a little bit about my story. So I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2012 when I was 29 years old. I found a lump in my breast. I was living in Argentina at the time. And I knew that I had a family history of breast cancer because my maternal grandmother had had breast cancer in her 30s, which was in the 1960s, and she had died from it, I think from ovarian cancer or from breast cancer that had spread when she was in her early 40s. So I knew this background history and that if I found a lump, it was something that needed to be checked out. So I went to the doctors, had a bit of a delay, but eventually 4 months later got a diagnosis that it was breast cancer. So this was in 2012. I was able to have, I was very, very lucky, first of all, that it hadn't spread, even though I'd had this quite long delay before diagnosis. I was able to have surgery, then chemotherapy, then radiotherapy, and then I started the drug tamoxifen because my cancer was estrogen positive, HER2 negative, which means that I could take these hormone-reducing drugs to control the cancer over a number of years. I was cured, as they say, and kind of went back to a normal-ish life, albeit with effects, lasting effects of chemo and radiotherapy and surgery and everything that does to your body. And of course, the tamoxifen as well, which all puts you into a slow menopause, which started when I was 30. But I went away and went back to work, and I was inspired to write a novel, which took me many years to write, which you can see on the screen. That's called Single Bald Female. Julia's got a copy with her if you want to hold it up. So it's actually a work of fiction inspired by my cancer experience. So it's about a woman who is diagnosed with breast cancer, and she also goes through a breakup at the same time, and she starts dating with a bald head. So it's kind of a little bit of comedy mixed in with lots of tragedy, but it's sort of happy, sad, uplifting story. And it's about the friendships she makes and things she learns about her family and her friends. And I don't like to say the word journey, but you know, the experience that she has. So that came out in 2022, but towards the end of, so this was 10 years after my diagnosis, so I was 39. And towards the end of 2021, just before the book came out, I started to feel a pain in my chest on my, a tenderness kind of here where the breastbone is, not too far from the site where I'd had breast cancer 10 years earlier. So I immediately thought, oh dear, this could be secondary breast cancer. I went to get it checked out. There is a very similar condition called costochondritis, which is something to do with the inflammation of the an inflammation around the bones. And unfortunately, it was kind of misdiagnosed, nothing to worry about, didn't get the correct scans. But eventually, 9 months later this time, I did get the correct scans and found out that it was secondary breast cancer and that it had spread to my bones. So for any of you who don't know, secondary breast cancer is when the cancer spreads from the breast to somewhere else in the body. So in my case, it was the bones. And at that point, it becomes incurable or stage 4, but there are lots of drugs to treat it. So I was put onto Zoladex injections and letrozole, basically to take all the estrogen out of my body, with another drug called ribociclib, which I think slows the growth of lots of different cells, not just cancer cells. And by the way, I'm not a scientist or a doctor, so don't take any of my explanations of what these drugs do, literally. But these drugs all worked incredibly well. They shrunk the cancer. It was a 8-centimeter tumor, so quite a big tumor in my sternum bone. They shrunk it to the point where it almost disappeared. I was then incredibly lucky to be able to have surgery to remove my entire sternum bone along with all the cancer. And that was 1.5 years ago. And I remain on all the drugs, but because the cancer has been removed surgically, I have a really good chance of, living for a long time. Secondary breast cancer doesn't have the best rate, and I still live with secondary breast cancer, but at the moment I'm really well and I'm able to do my job and live my life. But onto the PALB2 part of it. So in 2012, I had the test to see if I had carried the BRCA gene mutation, because obviously I did know that I had a family history, and I tested negative for PALB2, for the BRCA gene mutations. But my geneticist at the time, which was Gareth Evans, who I know, Mark, you're working with on the CANRIS study, he said there will be other gene mutations that can be tested for in future, and we'll keep your DNA on record, and further down the line, if this testing becomes available, we'll be able to retest. So about 8 years later, we tried to get that done, but I never heard anything back. So when I got my secondary diagnosis, my new oncologist said, we'll go back to Gareth Evans and see if he can test that DNA again. And sure enough, came back and said, you've tested negative for PALB2, which I'd heard of in the interim period because of someone in Canada who was diagnosed with breast cancer at the same time as me, who I was sort of friends with on social media. She had tested positive for the PALB2 mutation as well, so I knew a little bit about it. And Mark, I think you said that PALB2 was discovered in 2007, but in 2012, I was told they couldn't test for it. So that's why I only got tested many years later and found out. And for me, that was a huge light bulb moment, because I'd had 10 years of hearing that you may get breast cancer because you're overweight, because you're a smoker, because you drink alcohol, or any number of lifestyle factors plus bad luck. And I didn't smoke. I wasn't overweight. I was really healthy and active, and I didn't drink masses of alcohol, certainly not compared with other people I knew. So for me to discover something that had been the cause of my cancer felt really positive and really, really important. My mum then went away and got tested, and she tested positive as well. So we know that it came down the maternal line. But as you were saying, Mark, I think you were comparing people from different families in terms of the additional risk factors on top of having the PALB2 gene that might affect them. But for me, what has always been a fascination is that I got breast cancer at 29, and my mum is in her 70s and has never had breast cancer, yet her mum had breast cancer in her 30s. So I've always been fascinated to know what could be the possible reasons on top of the gene mutation that meant that I got cancer and my mum didn't. And from my discussions with the new geneticist that I met a couple of years ago, the only things that we can pinpoint are things like, I've lived my adult life in big cities. My mum lives slightly more in the countryside, so there might be pollution and those lifestyle factors. But also another big one is that my mum had had children by the age of 29 and I hadn't. And I was told that the optimum age to have had children would have been 18, because I understand that if you do have children, then something happens with the estrogen that makes it slightly less likely that you would develop breast cancer. So that's that. So currently I work as a food writer, but I also host the Breast Cancer Now podcast. I'm also involved with the charity Copperfield in the UK, young person's breast cancer charity. And they also have my own podcast, Life in Food, which you can listen to on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all the usual channels. So even if you're in the US and you can't get my book, you can get the podcasts. And there is an episode on food and cancer with the amazing Chris Hallinger, who founded Copperfield and lived with secondary breast cancer for 15 years. Let me just see if there's anything else that I wanted to talk to you about. Is there anything else, Julia, that you can think of that you wanted me to cover?
Maybe how you coped emotionally.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yes.
How I coped emotionally. Well, I mean, famously, I think a lot of people find that after the chemo ends, after the radiotherapy ends, and you're sort of released from active treatment into the world, that's when you really struggle. So for me, that point in 2013, when I finished my last radiotherapy and I was just sort of set free into the world without my regular hospital visit, that was really, really hard for me. But for me, going back to work and being able to get back to exercise was always the thing that kind of helped me mentally. And the same 10 years later, when I had my secondary diagnosis, obviously that was even harder. But when I had the surgery, I was very, that was a very mentally difficult period for me, because after the surgery, it was a huge major surgery and I couldn't exercise and I couldn't work and I sort of didn't have that purpose. But for me, finding a purpose and doing things, and at the moment I'm actually part of a campaign to get the drug Enhertu available to women with HER2 low breast cancer, secondary breast cancer patients, because it's not available on the NHS in England, even though it is available in other European countries, including Scotland. And so having the purpose of kind of writing about my experiences, but also writing about restaurants and doing my podcast, speaking to people, doing things like this, all kind of is purpose giving and motivating, and just stops you from thinking, I've got cancer. And I think also I just want to give the positive side of it, because we always think cancer is horrible and tragic, and it is, but I've been living with some form of cancer for 13 years now, and I've lived with secondary breast cancer for 2.5 years. And I think when I was diagnosed, the average rate of survival was about 2 to 3 years, or 2 to 5 years with secondary breast cancer. And I'm here 2.5 years later, and I'm currently no evidence of disease, and living a really great life. And that's all we can do. And the breast cancer community around the world is incredible. And I've no doubt the PALB2 community is incredible as well. And I think that knowledge is power. And it's great for me to know that I have this gene mutation. I would absolutely love to know more about, I hope that before I die, and maybe you can help with this, Mark, I will discover exactly what caused my cancer, and what, on top of the gene mutation, what these real factors were that caused it. And hopefully that will be the key also to finding out how we can prevent cancers in future. But I know that's a big ask.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Laura. Yeah, very inspiring story. And just wanted to pick up on just relating to your story to mine, and a bit about the children. Actually, my diagnosis was age 43, which I still consider young. I had a grandmother who died from breast cancer 47, and my dad passed away from prostate at 50. But I had children at 25 and 30 years old, and I still developed breast cancer. And I was a heptathlete for 10 years at track and field, very, very sporty. So like yourself, I'd like to know where and why and how it can be cured before it happens, actually, if not even cured. But yeah, not a small ask, Mark and team. But we're here to support.
Maybe
I
can jump in there. Firstly, that was an
Yeah.
amazing presentation, Laura. There are lots of
Thank you,
positive
Laura.
comments in the chat as well. Everyone's very appreciative.
Oh, good.
I mean, just thinking about, why some women, like your story is interesting with your mother, and the contrast there. And there were some questions in the chat about, having children. I mean, that only makes a very small difference. It's not a big thing. So, if you took 1,000 women, you could statistically see a difference in those that have had children younger and those older. But if on an individual basis, it makes virtually no difference at all. It's just a small contributory factor. So I think that's important to bear in mind that some of these things are really, not playing major roles, and they're just, not even a partial explanation. And I think, maybe in your situation, it could be due to these other genetic modifiers, to some extent, that maybe your mother inherited some protective factors from her parents. And maybe, you inherited the gene itself from your mother, but you inherited some other factors from your father that sort of, increased the strength of that gene mutation and made it more likely that you're going to get breast cancer. The genetics of this are more complicated than just one single gene alteration. We know that much for sure. Particularly, someone like you who's had it at a young age with no other major risk factors, that this seems like quite a plausible explanation. And it's definitely something we're working on. We're actually running studies at the moment looking at how we can use this in the clinical setting. So the technology behind this is tried and tested, as is the science. It's just about how we implement it. One of the drawbacks, which I didn't talk about, is that a lot of the testing has been done in populations of North American and Northern European ancestry. So we know it doesn't work so well in other ethnic groups, and that's obviously a big problem. And that's something we're trying to address, because that's stopping us somewhat from rolling this out. Because we really need to make sure that it works well across different ethnic groups as well. But I'm very confident. Sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say, can I make one more comment, which is that I've always had a theory, even before I knew that I had the PALB2 mutation, that my getting breast cancer when I did was due to a very long, prolonged period of stress through work. And so many people that I've met who've had breast cancer over the years have said similar. They've been through a massive life-changing event, such as a bereavement, a divorce, or incredibly stressful work situation. And I always thought, well, lots of my friends, work all night long as lawyers or whatever, but they didn't get this. But then when I discovered that I had the gene mutation and they didn't, it kind of made more sense. So I would love for more studies to be done on the causes of the correlation between stress and cancer, which I know currently is not proven, but I think that's partly because there haven't been enough studies, perhaps.
It's difficult because stress is quite subjective. There's no easy way of measuring it. So, for example, you can make a link between height and breast cancer because you can measure people's height and it's very definitive. So we know that if you're slightly taller than average, your risk of breast cancer is a bit higher. But stress is very variable and it changes throughout your life, and it's also very subjective. So if you can't measure something accurately, it's then very difficult to study it. So I'm not saying it's not linked, but I'm just saying it's really hard to prove it one way or another, because of that, because of these problems. So, I mean, diet is a bit like that as well. I mean, interesting, you know, that's your line of work, but, you know, asking people what they've tried to monitor, you know, asking people what they've eaten over many years is almost impossible. You know, again, that's something that people often wonder if it's due to, if they're dietary factors, very difficult to measure and therefore very difficult to study.
Thank you very much, Laura. Lots of comments in the chat box, and yeah, amazing presentation. Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for your commentary. Okay, I'm going to now move to Q&As. So this part of the Q&As are the questions that we received in advance. And they really cover the following areas that I'm showing on screen. Early detection screening, family history, treatment research, which Mark's already covered, links to other cancers, which we also some touched on. So we'll see how we get on with those, HRT, and any other questions. We'll power through them and then we open up for questions from the chat and also for the audience. Okay, let's start with screening. And they are relating to other cancers linked to PALB2. We already mentioned ovarian. And also particularly I've seen a number of questions about pancreatic screening, if it's in place or not in place. Some other countries have, or some people in the group are being screened. I think they are mostly US. There is a program there, but I don't think there's anything in the UK. So what's the latest on that? I'll pass on to Mark. And if is Andrew on the call? I'm just checking.
Finally got here. Sorry, so sorry.
Welcome. So we've got a few. There'll be a few
Disastrous
questions for you.
Good timing, Angie. So screening percentages for other cancers linked to PALB2. Well, the ovarian cancer risk is probably around 3 to 5% over a lifetime. Very, very low risk under the age of 50. So I think if you're under that age, you don't really have to worry about it. And maybe once you reach the menopause, have a think about having your ovaries removed. But it's not, certainly if you're having you know, gynecological surgery for other reasons, it might be worth doing. Whether it's worth doing by itself is debatable. I mean, there are things like the contraceptive pill that if you've taken the pill, you know, for a few years, that will reduce your risk of ovarian cancer. So it's a bit balanced. You know, it's not a strong risk, so it's a bit nuanced, that one. You can have a chat with your genetics team about that. Pancreatic cancer risk is also quite low, probably around about 2 to 3% lifetime risk. Again, rare under 50. If you don't smoke, don't drink heavily and have a healthy weight, then again, you're going to put that, you know, very much in your favor.
But currently there is no pancreatic screening in the UK, at least under
NICE guidelines. It's a big international debate, and Americans are quite enthusiastic about pancreatic screening surveillance. The UK, we're less. We haven't really seen. There have been studies published, but they haven't really shown that it actually saves lives. So, and it's quite a big. It's not a trivial type of screening. Both for the patient and also, you know, the cost and the effort and everything. So we're not convinced that it's actually useful at this point.
I think the other issue, isn't it, Mark, that some of these lesions that they pick up, we don't know if they will actually progress to an invasive cancer.
Yeah.
So you can pick up very early sort of lesions in the pancreas. You're putting people through biopsies and interventions that can in themselves cause pancreatitis, which in itself can be fatal. So there are things that is the risks and benefits of that screening that are still really kind of not fully elucidated. And then, as Mark says, the long-term survival benefit of having that screening is also unclear. So even if you're picking up lesions doesn't necessarily mean that you're catching things early and impacting on long-term outcomes. So we're in the UK, we're still a little bit cautious of doing more harm than good with pancreatic screening, which is why we recommend it through a research study like EuroPac rather than as standard of care.
Thank you. Second question or group of questions, what to do with young people with PALB2 and screening. When does it need to start? From what age? Does it change with age?
Yeah.
Anything that should be done with young people. Look, my daughter, for example, is waiting to be called in with a blood test. She's 23, so we haven't done it yet. But what if one has found they've got PALB2 and young, what they should be doing?
Yeah, well, I think as Mark clearly outlined in his talk earlier, which I was trying to listen into but couldn't all of it, sorry. It's really influenced by lots of factors, the risk with PALB2. And we know that, using tools like CanRisk can help guide us as to whether somebody does need to start screening under the age of 30. So in the UK, we very much use CanRisk to determine whether somebody might need earlier screening than 30. And the things that are going to influence that are family history, other hormonal and lifestyle risk factors. So I think from the perspective of younger women, it's thinking about what is modifiable in terms of their lifestyle, but also what is the family history like, and are there early onset breast cancers in close relatives that might be modifying their risk and maybe shifting their risk such that they should be thinking about screening before the age of 30. Generally speaking, though, if somebody doesn't have a very significant family history of early onset cancer under the age of 30, then there wouldn't really be a need to start screening younger than 30, because actually the absolute risks below the age of 30 would be low for that person. So I hope that answers the question.
So the process is, if one is 20 years old, found out they've got PALB2, they've got a meeting with genetic counselor to discuss all of this. There is a personalized recommendation based on the family history, and then they take that letter back to GP, and then the program is in place from whatever age. How does it work in
what
practice?
tends to happen is we actually would refer those individuals into the very high risk, or into the screening program, and then the very high screening program. It used to be that they wouldn't keep a sort of track record of younger women. We'd have to bring those women back to genetics and refer them at the time that they need their screening. But now they will keep those people on the register, and they'll call them at the right time based on the personalized risk assessment that we've done for them. So really, any woman who comes into clinic and is found to carry a PALB2 mutation below the normal screening age of 30, we would do this formal CanRisk assessment for them and make a decision about when they need to start screening and refer them at that point.
Thank you. Right, and then the question here about the blood test. Is there blood test for PALB2 carriers? And what there recently have been some blood test information published in some articles and newspapers. What's happening here?
Yeah, so this is a big area of interest in terms of research, and obviously if we could have something like this, it'd be really amazing. We wouldn't have to have, maybe we could do it together with mammograms, or even it could replace mammograms. So everyone's excited about this. I think at the moment it's still a bit early, and certainly these sorts of blood-based tests seem to work better with other cancers like ovarian cancer and pancreatic cancer rather than breast cancer, because it's to do with how many tumor cells are shed into the blood, essentially. So we have very accurate ways of picking up bits of DNA from the tumor in the blood, but some tumors shed more of these cells in the blood than others, so the breast is a bit harder to look at. And again, with any screening test, the problem is that how many times do you get a positive test? Is there really a true cancer versus just a false alarm? Because what you don't want is a test where it's positive 10% of the time, but only 1% of those is actually a true cancer, and the other times it's just a false alarm, because then you're just worrying everyone all the time. So these tests still need some work. I do think that this is where the future lies. The research is happening fairly quickly. So I am optimistic, but they're not ready yet for clinical, for routine clinical use.
Okay. Genetics and family history. What are the origins of BRCA1 and 2 and the connection with PALB2, which we touched on, but not on the origins?
So we know that these genes, obviously they must have arisen, these alterations must have arisen at some time, but we very, very rarely see brand new mutations in these genes. So they're almost always inherited from either the mother or the father. But at some point in time that, they must have arisen. And, you've highlighted there, for example, and that was, I think, the BRCA2 gene in the Scottish population. You can find these little pockets, like in the Jewish population, there are clear BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene alterations. For PALB2, we know that in the French Canadian population and in the Finnish population, there are certain alterations that are common in those populations. But in your average Northern European person, there isn't a particular founder mutation that's running in these genes.
A couple of questions for Vishak on family testing. What advice exists on testing children? From what age it should be considered?
Yeah, great question. And a question that we get quite often actually in the hereditary cancer setting. So certainly for PALB2, the national guidance in the UK, possibly internationally actually, is that testing occurs from the age of 18 and above. That's not to say that the information can't be discussed, with young people. And we know that they cope better when we do that and allow them to be part of that conversation. But certainly predictive genetic testing is offered from the age of 18 and above.
Second question was actually, we just touched on the screening process, and it seems to be a difficulty getting blood tests done. So that's different to the blood test we discussed earlier. This is for blood tests for the testing in clinics in Essex. What's the current processes like on getting tested for PALB2 in the UK? Where does one go?
I'm assuming this is referring to sort of the predictive genetic testing.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Yeah. So usually most genetic services who would have tested the first relative, I suppose, in each family, usually give out a relatives letter, which sort of at the top will have to make concern, and that several copies can be passed around to the relevant family members, really. And if you take that to if they take that to their GPs, they can then get referred into their local genetic service. So I think Essex would be GOS, really. So if they're having trouble accessing it, I would advise that the original person that got tested just go back to their genetic service and check whether they were given a letter like that. Sometimes we do send it, but it may not have got there or something like that. But it's very easy to do to pass on that letter. And most GPs will then send it across with their referral, make it easier. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. All right, another question is about family testing. Where does one find, how do they stay updated on treatment and scanning developments, and how to deal with the family members who might be scared to be tested or too young?
Yeah, of course. So I'll probably take the staying up to date part of it first. And today is probably evidence of a great forum that allows you to stay up to date. And I'm not going to say let's stalk Mark, but actually he is actually the world expert. So following the right forums, following the PALB2 sort of interest group are all really good places to get evidence-based information and advice. But equally, the genetic services are well placed to do that as well. Some will send out sort of information regularly with any updates. Others may not, but if you're looking for a review or if you've got specific questions, they're always open to being contacted. And I'm sure you'll get a response. The second part of it was, sorry, repeat that for me, Julia.
Whether if the family members are too scared to be tested, or too young.
Yeah. So we do see that. We see, any health risk comes with a little sort of package of fear for all of us as human beings. That's quite normal. And perhaps it might be helpful to reflect on why that fear exists. Is that because of certain experiences within the family or for that individual? Is it that person's way of preparing themselves to then make a decision about testing itself? Maybe seeking some psychological support, some genetic counselling support to really unpack what that fear is about, what they're feeling and what they're thinking might be helpful things.
Okay, treatment questions. I think this one we have already discussed, risks for other cancers, but is there any more, Andrew, that we could add here? I'm considering preventative breast cancer treatments. What are the risks for other cancers?
I think Mark covered all of this
Yes,
really
we covered that.
nicely,
Right.
didn't he? Yeah.
Okay, latest updates on PALB2 specific treatments.
So I think the
I
main
think-
topic here is, as usual with these meetings, is the role of PARP inhibitors in PALB2. And we know that it's very effective for BRCA1 and BRCA2. Unfortunately, the trials where that was studied did not include PALB2 carriers at the time. I mean, this comes back to olaparib as well, it's the same thing. So for now, women who have breast cancer are not, PARP inhibitors like olaparib have not been licensed for most women who have breast cancer with PALB2 gene alterations, although we can be fairly certain that the drug will be as effective in them as it will be for someone who's got BRCA2 carrier. It's probably unlikely that people are going to do that sort of study. So we are left in a bit of a difficult position. And I think the only way forward there is actually to put a bit of pressure on the relevant powers to make them see that, logically, PARP should also work for PALB2. But this is a tricky, thorny issue that I remember Andrew spoke on a couple of years ago, and I don't think we've really been able to progress it since then.
No, is that the pressures from the patients?
It'll come down to pressure from everyone on this call, I think, yes, and their friends. But I don't think it's gonna happen any other way.
No, okay. We need to unite better in the UK.
So it was interesting that when Laura said that she was doing something for her too, and maybe she could use. It'd be interesting to know what her experience is, and once you've done it for one drug, probably the pathways and the processes will be similar for others. So, so that I found that very interesting when I heard that, Laura.
There was a question about the OncoScore test. I think, Mark, you and I were not sure whether it's Oncotype or some other test.
We're not sure
It's
about
predictive.
that. Yeah.
Or it's like shows the risk of recurrence. I think it's Oncotype, maybe.
And there's a
It's like Oncotype.
Oncotype test that looks at the risk of recurrence.
I mean, the Oncotype test is about whether chemotherapy will have benefit or not. It determines benefit of chemotherapy, adjuvant chemotherapy.
It's used by medical professionals, not open to patients.
Yeah, by oncologists, yeah.
Right, and the question here is about recurrence statistics and double mastectomy versus single. Are there any stats on recurrence?
So the recurrence that really relates to the actual breast cancer that you've got, like the grade of the breast cancer, the type of breast cancer, importantly whether lymph nodes are involved or not, which they are with stage 3. So and that's not really relevant to the actual PALB2 gene alteration. So it's a bit like the horse and the stable door. The PALB2 is like the stable door, and once that's open and the horse is bolting, which is like the cancer, then that's not, the stable door doesn't have any influence anymore over where the horse goes once it's left the stable, if you follow that analogy. And it's the same with this, basically. So we don't think there's any difference in recurrence rates for PALB2 versus non-PALB2. Double mastectomy advised over single. Well, I think if you've got stage 3 breast cancer, you've still got a good, there's a good prognosis. So you would, the issue there is that you would have a risk of getting a breast cancer in the other breast, a brand new breast cancer in the other breast over the course of your lifetime. You're young at 32. So, so that's something that you could talk to your oncologist and your genetics team about. But it may well be a good way to go, actually, at that point.
Okay. breast cancer vaccines. What's the latest on that?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of interest in cancer vaccines in the treatment of cancer. In fact, you know, one of the big companies that are running that BioNTech, they're the ones that developed the COVID vaccine. And I was actually at a presentation from the founder of that company last week, and this question got raised to her, and she said actually it's, you know, what they're really focusing on is the treatment, using vaccines as a form of treatment for cancer. But actually, when you're a healthy person and you've inherited, you know, you've got a gene mutation, it's less clear that vaccines are going to work in that situation. So I'm not sure that this is going to happen anytime soon, actually, in terms of preventing breast cancer, but it could well happen in terms of treating breast cancer.
Is there a link between hormone treatments for IVF and cancer risk for PALB2 carriers?
So any hormonal manipulation can affect the breast cancer risk, but if you think about something like IVF, you're only taking it for a very short pulse in your life. So in reality, it probably, if it does make a difference, it's going to make a tiny, tiny, tiny difference. And it shouldn't, I don't think if you carry a PALB2 gene alteration, that shouldn't prevent you from having IVF or getting pregnant.
Hey, I've been advised to get my BMI below 30, that's weight management, before risk-reducing surgery. What are recommendations around this? Lose weight before surgery.
Yeah, so certainly at Guy's in our specialist MDT clinic, we do recommend weight reduction before risk-reducing surgery, and this is really to improve recovery from the surgery, improve wound healing. There are risks associated with the general anaesthetic if you are more, if your weight is higher. So there are many reasons why our plastic surgeons, particularly if you're having an autologous reconstruction where your time under the general anaesthetic is going to be longer, they would prefer women to have lost weight prior to that surgeries performed. So certainly that's one of the recommendations we have at Guy's. Advised to take tamoxifen before risk-reducing surgery, or just to take tamoxifen, presumably?
I think it's just to take
presumably, yeah. And as Mark said, you know, we're learning that PALB2 is not dissimilar to BRCA2 in terms of the sort of the histology profile. So certainly we do recommend tamoxifen and anastrozole to women who are increased risk of ER positive disease. So I think it is something that we do discuss with our PALB2 mutation carriers.
Andrew, what are your thoughts on weight reduction through taking Ozempic?
Oh, that's a bit of a loaded question, Julia.
I know, I've been talking to my oncologist about it, and he said there are some benefits in taking Ozempic.
I think there is, but then there's been some recent data to suggest that maybe it's not the wonder drug that we think it is in terms of weight loss. So I think it's a tricky one. I think for individuals who are really have a very high BMI, it can really help kickstart that weight loss. But I'm not so sure for individuals who are around 30 and sort of not in the obese category. I think maybe other options before that starts. And I think you also have to take into account family history of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, other high cholesterol, other risk factors that can compound the obesity and increase risk as well when you're considering whether to start somebody on a drug like that.
Well, exercise is always better.
Well, it's hard when it's hard, yeah.
Okay, and then the last question is in this section is about radiation, avoiding dental x-rays, since PALB2 interferes with repair pathway. Should radiation be, additional radiation, I guess, be avoided through the scans, dental x-rays, and chest radiation?
Yeah,
and
I mean, dental x-rays have a tiny amount of radiation. So, and actually, we don't have good evidence that PALB2 carriers have a higher risk of cancer because of through radiation. So I'm not particularly worried about this. I don't make any recommendations. Most radiologists are very sensible, and everyone tries to limit the amount of radiation anyone gets. But then, you can get quite a lot of radiation just by taking a transatlantic flight, or if you live in Cornwall, that's also bad. So, I think you have to just keep that in context. And if you need a CT scan, then you should have a CT scan. I wouldn't worry about PALB2.
Thank you. Hey, research updates. Is there higher incidence of PALB2 in the UK than in the US?
Not particularly. No. I mean, I showed those figures. That's a combination of UK US data. Both populations are very mixed. It's when you go to less well mixed populations like French Canadian or the Finnish where you see difference in rates. But for a mixed population like the French, Italian, UK, Australian, the rates are all very similar.
Okay, so the next question is to do with the promotion of PALB2 as a risk alongside BRCA, which we already covered. Also, there's been an article, or actually a publication through Sky News on ovarian cancer vaccine. And whether, PALB2 vaccine can be, I think a similar question to the previous on that vaccine.
Really. I mean, I think, these vaccines are going to be useful in treatment, but I'm not sure they're going to be useful in prevention anytime soon.
Thank you. The next question, I think we also covered about recurrence of breast cancer and whether PALB2 has an impact. And you mentioned it's more to do with the type of cancer rather than PALB2.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and this is also, we touched about contralaterals, having cancer in the other breast, if it's the risk of it higher for carriers of PALB2 versus non-carriers.
Yes.
And
So
is there percentage risk established or not?
So this is a risk of a new primary breast cancer. As we talked about before, recurrence is something different. And Mark, please chip in as well. But my understanding is that some of the recent studies suggest that for PALB2 carriers, there is an increased contralateral risk, probably not dissimilar to BRCA2 again, but it's going to be influenced again by the age of the patient, whether they have premenopausal breast cancer, and also what type of breast cancer they had previously, whether it was an ER negative breast cancer, estrogen negative breast cancer. So, I mean, we tend to suggest that women who have a BRCA2 pathogenic variant, they have maybe a 1 to 2% risk per year of a contralateral breast cancer, and it's probably similar, would you say, Mark, for PALB2?
Possibly.
Possibly. But that's going to be influenced by drugs like tamoxifen they might be taking. It'll be influenced by other factors, exactly as Mark mentioned previously as well. Might be influenced potentially by chemotherapy that they've had to treat their previous breast cancer as well. So there are lots of things that will then influence that contralateral risk. And again, we can use CanRisk to help in quantifying that risk for women, taking into account all those factors.
The next set of questions we also covered. These are links to other cancers. I'm just quickly show questions that we've received. We talked about pancreatic, we talked about ovarian. There were actually quite a few questions about melanoma and skin cancers. So
there's a question in the chat just now, and I've just put that not really thought to be an association. Is there, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think again with lots of these cancers, if there's a big association, we would know about it. We can't rule out very small increase, very small associations or very small increased risk for these cancers. But you might be at that low level of risk may not actually make much difference from a clinical or management point of view.
That's the same for stomach cancer and having a Helicobacter pylori bacteria test and developing stomach cancer that might be linked to PALB2.
So, I mean, I did a study looking at this a while ago, and we thought, there's possibly a small link with stomach cancer, but it's been really hard to prove. And so again, if that's true, it's not going to be a major risk factor. H. pylori is an independent risk factor for stomach cancer. So if you've got H. pylori, then it does need treating.
Okay, HRT and other medications. Is it safe to take HRT after surgery?
I think we may have answered this in the chat, actually, Yulia, while this
Yeah.
has been going on. Mark and
Okay.
Shaka have been typing as well. So hopefully we've answered that, I think.
Mhm. Okay, the next one is about the length of time for post-cancer medications such as anastrozole, how long to take.
Yeah,
the
well,
gold standard?
I think that, well, I think the gold standard, it will depend on this, your personal diagnosis of breast cancer, the stage, the oncology treatment plan that they have. So I don't think, you know, in terms of gold standard, I think it's best to have that conversation with your oncologist, because it's not, you know, there are other factors that they will take into account. For example, they may take into account bone density, that sort of thing, other and potential risks of taking it longer term versus the benefits of that drug. So I don't think you can say there is a gold standard length of time. I think it's best for each individual to have that conversation with their oncology team, really.
In my case, my letrozole I've been taking for 5 years, extended by another 5, but it's again individual discussion on your case with the oncologist.
Yeah.
All right, next question was, I think it's sort of medical, more specific for someone, is taking aromatase inhibitors after mastectomy. And is there any data that can apply to our community?
I mean, to be honest, not that I'm aware of. I know there are studies sort of looking at the use of tamoxifen and anastrozole, roxifene in a preventative setting for mutation carriers in general, but I wouldn't say we have clear data on specifically PALB2. Mark, are you aware of anything specifically on PALB2?
No, I think that's yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have specific data at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to look at, you know, the actual characteristics of the cancer. At that point, it becomes more important than the actual gene itself.
Okay, and the last 2 questions are there any specific non-profit organizations for PALB2 worldwide?
Do you mean like a charity?
Like a charities?
Yes. I don't think there's a worldwide one specifically for PALB2. Maybe that's what we could start here. I'd love that. So if people want to do that, then that'd be good. But you know, in the UK, certainly, I mean, a lot of my research funding has come through CRUK. They fund a lot of our breast cancer research. They fund the Embrace study. They're very interested in early detection studies as well. So you know, they've been super helpful over many years.
Thank you, Mark. And the second question will be answered. The website's down. Hopefully get recovered next year.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about this. We had a cyber attack affecting the medical school of the university in February, and that was hosting the website. So all our websites are currently down at the moment. It's a real pain, and it may still take some time for them to come back. I'm looking to some alternative options at the moment. But yeah, I'm sorry about that at the moment. We will, as soon as we can, we'll get it up and running again.
Yeah, if you need any more information, let me know through the group on Facebook, or we posted the email address. Is that working email address, Mark? That we showed
email
earlier?
address works fine. Yeah.
Right, I'll share it around.
Yulia, there's just another question in the chat. Somebody's repeated. I'm happy. They've asked about, is a bilateral mastectomy recommended for patients that have already had a lumpectomy, chemo, and radiation treatment? Only got tested after diagnosis. This is a really tricky question to answer for what, you know, because again, for each individual patient, it's going to be different depending on the stage of their initial diagnosis. It's that balance, risk-benefit balance of what is the risk of recurrence for that individual. You know, the radiotherapy treatment that you've had for that breast will help to reduce future risk in the same breast, for example. The tamoxifen or anastrozole that you're taking will also help to reduce risk. So these are very individualized personal discussions that you can have with your genetics team to assess that risk and to balance whether there is, you know, is that risk of a new primary in the future high enough to warrant mastectomy for you at this point in time. And there are some women that will choose that option and some women won't. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to say it's recommended as such, but it's an option. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Were there any more questions, Anja, Vishak, and Mark, that you saw in the chat? I think you were super efficient answering them as we went along the webinar.
I hope we haven't missed any.
Yeah, if you have posted the questions and we haven't covered, please do come on the call. I think at one point we'll stop recording, so then we can open up the webinar to participants on screen to ask questions.
I will stop recording now.
Thank you.